So we're now going to move on to Linda Hart, who is from Finland. Linda is a social researcher working in Finland, working on the topics of political and legal sociology, both for a living and in her free time. Linda Hart is going to give us a brief look at how the concept of gender identity appears in non-discrimination policies and goals of the European Commission, which is the sort of administrative apparatus of the European Union.
I'm still recovering from what Frances was telling all of us. I'm afraid my talk is going to be a bit less exciting, but with interesting info and content and things that surprised me when I was digging around. I work as a social researcher, but policies of the European Commission or the European Union in general are not my specialty. So this was kind of like a little extra project. Some time ago, I contacted Joe, if I remember right, asking if there was any kind of pro bono research that could be done for WDI. And yes, then I came up with this short little expose, let's say, of the topic desired, which was the promotion of gender identity as an object of non-discrimination by the European Union, and focusing on the European Commission and its recent past and planned actions. Generally speaking, treaties of the European Union prohibit sex discrimination in terms of advancing equality between men and women, with the focus being on the functioning of the labor market and in equal access to goods and services. The EU, the European Union, is really an economic community. So, or whatever it does, or let's say at least the kind of more traditional understanding of what the European Union does in the field of non-discrimination and equality law is in order to help the common market function. So goods, services, the free movement of people, for example, including same-sex couples within the EU from one member state to another. So in the 2000s, the noughties, the 2000s, several directives, that is EU legislation that member states are then supposed to implement. Several directives have been passed in the area of non-discrimination. So this concerns religion, disability, age, equal treatment of men and women. Back then, the vocabulary still was very much like this: sexual orientation. In the EU, there's the European Court of Justice, which interprets EU law, which has given some case law on the protection of gender identity, like as an offshoot of sex discrimination law, as it were. I'm trying to keep it simple. There is also the European Court of Human Rights, which is not an EU institution. It's a separate organization of states, the Council of Europe, but as EU states are all member states of the Council of Europe as well, the main human rights norms tend to come from the European Court of Human Rights when it interprets the European Convention on Human Rights. But basically, the European Court of Human Rights already a few years ago has recognized gender identity as an object of protection, but this relates mostly to legal gender recognition. And for example, in Finland, there's a self-ID law drafted, being pushed by the government, but it's been perplexing to see all the NGOs, not just the rainbow NGOs, as it were, but also women's and children's NGO, pushing a very similar rhetoric of, oh, this is all required by international human rights. And then they never mention that the European Court of Human Rights only requires, the European Court of Human Rights does not require self-ID. But let's say gender identity is pretty much an object, a bone of contention in many ways, and it resides more in the larger plans and hasn't been approved as an object of protection by, let's say, all EU member states. But there really has been more and more emphasis to promote the inclusion of gender identity under the umbrella of non-discrimination more generally. But in many ways, this can also happen through different sets of policies and guidelines and recommendations, that is soft law instead of hard law. There are two colleagues of mine, scholars from Central and Eastern Europe, Esther Kovacs and Elena Zaharenko, who wrote a peer-reviewed article which came out late last year. It was very good. They have analyzed the changing meanings attributed to gender in EU policy documents. They conclude that there has indeed been a shift where this term is increasingly being used in the context of individual identities instead of the social structure of gender in society. In some contexts, it's used as an exact synonym for sex, i.e. the physical reality of humans being divided into female and male individuals. And this is very much in contrast with the kind of understanding that gender is a historical or social and analytical category, even just from a kind of a scholarly point of view, without particular, for example, radical feminist or gender critical perspectives into it. And Kovacs and Zaharenko argue that this shift in the meanings attributed to gender in EU policy documents does lend some credence to the kind of right-wing and conservative criticism that there is of gender politics. But this is really because to a lot of the lay public, let's say, feminism is just one big monolith, and they might not recognize that there are different factions or different movements within feminism that might disagree with each other. But this brings us to the rubric of so-called anti-gender movements. So Poland have been grouped under the rubric of anti-gender movements in certain, in many contexts, due to the right-wing politicians in power that have then also in rather ruthless ways mobilized against lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and both women's liberation and let's say LGBT politics. One of the main problems is that under this label, it's never really easy to know what the interlocutor is arguing for. Let's say, once again, recently in Finland, I've heard a kind of a queer theorist say that this anti-gender movement includes feminists, includes actors who call themselves feminists. So this is avoiding to say, this way they can avoid to say the word radical feminist, or they can avoid to say gender critical. They're just saying, oh, these aren't real feminists who say that sex matters. But let's say in its more usual meaning, anti-gender movements or anti-gender networks refer to, let's say, our known opponents from many years back, the Vatican or right-wing populism or religious conservatism. So it's good to pay attention to this, that if someone is talking about anti-gender movements, and it's often a kind of mobilization against where do all these different and networked and intersecting movements get their funding from, and what are they arguing for. But for example, we know very well that the Vatican or right-wing populists often argue against abortion, but then again, feminists tend not to argue against abortion, to try and cut it quite simple. But I would say that sometimes there is a desire to map anyone saying no to, let's say, the current form of gender identity politics as somehow reactionary or right-wing. Well, I suppose anyone on social media has heard all this claptrap already. but yeah, like I mentioned earlier, internal disagreements within feminism are not always recognized by the larger public. In this context, for example, in right-wing populism, gender may be taken in a very simplistic manner as an identity category in which one can choose one's gender. And mobilizing against this can be a very kind of attention-grabbing political phenomenon. And this happens in other countries, not just in Hungary and Poland, which are kind of more famous for this. So in a shift from a kind of a structural understanding of gender to individualized experiences of gender identity, the focus moves from wide-scale power relations to individual expressions. What might be the focus of feminist efforts then? Is it socioeconomic realities in the labor market, and, for example, informal care work, or cultural and social categories? Well, seeing the categories of woman and man as immaterial identities kind of paves the way to how a variety of identity labels have been created and multiplied in LGBT, I'd like to call them subcultures, during the past couple of decades. So perhaps genderqueer, non-binary, agender. For example, genderqueer and non-binary, to my understanding, come from perhaps the kind of queer zine culture of the 1990s in the United States, and then have kind of been disseminated around the world with the help of the internet in many ways, and these kind of rainbow subcultures. But really, then if we look at the kind of actual documents of the European Commission available online, there were a couple of surprises in stock there. Recent key documents do summarize what is going on in the gender identity policies of the European Commission. And quite honestly, I was surprised at how captured the language was in many ways. And you could see that there in many ways might be a shift going on, as some people, let's say, writing the body of the report of what's been done in recent years still say something like same-sex couples, but then the preface may hold same-gender couples. So first, the final report from 2015 to 2019 on the list of actions to advance LGBTI equality. It lays out actions and developments during the past few years. And most of the vocabulary is pretty much the point. There was a lot of emphasis of same-sex marriage as a social and legal phenomenon. But an interesting discrepancy, as in a celebratory preface in this document, Helena Dalli, the Commissioner for Equality from 2019 to 2024, so she'll be in her job for a few more years. The term used for lesbian, gay, and some bisexual relationships is same-gender couples, even though the main body of the text talks about same-sex couples and same-sex relations. And in this and in other documents, there are signs of kind of shying away from talking about sex as a coherent and meaningful category. And I suppose this is due to the people working in the European Commission wanting to communicate an awareness of the kind of social and political trends by using this kind of new inclusive vocabulary. But really, what was most interesting and surprising then was another document, the LGBTIQ, note the added Q, strategy 2020 to 2025. It talks about lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, non-binary, intersex, and queer people, as well as of the legal recognition of same-gender couples. And the list repeated when talking about non-discrimination takes the form of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, echoing very much the Yogyakarta principles, a non-binding document drafted by experts in international law on sexual orientation and gender identity in 2007. The Yogyakarta Principles, well, there's also a later document from, is it 2017? But the latter one being perhaps not as influential as the first one. The Yogyakarta Principles has received has been used a lot in lobbying efforts, and it's been perplexing to see that it has almost received the aura of some kind of existing norms in international law, when in the first place it was really just a kind of an exercise by these experts of reinterpreting the existing norms so that they would take into account sexual orientation and gender identity. And some of us might have heard that at least one of the signatories, Robert Wintermute, a professor of law, has since then stepped back from endorsing it. And I must say that when I was a student back then, I couldn't kind of see how detrimental it would become to women's rights. And Wintermute's critique is pretty much the same. The need to be able to be open about all these characteristics is kind of called for in the LGBTIQ strategy of the European Commission. At the same time, placing having a life partner of the same sex to a similar position as what kind of sex characteristics one has, and this is kind of feels like it's not in balance really. The object of protection from discrimination becomes further muddled when the strategy mentions that, quote, the Commission is examining how non-binary, intersex, and queer people can be better protected against discrimination, as all of these are quite difficult to define, with intersex being perhaps the most kind of easily and empirically definable term, as it refers to differences in sex development. But what does non-binary or what does queer really mean as an object of non-discrimination? And it proceeds to saying things like, quote, trans, non-binary, and intersex people are often not recognized in law or in practice, resulting in legal difficulties for both their private and family life, including cross-border situations. So this would refer to perhaps a couple moving from one EU member state to another. And indeed, in the case of transgender persons, a discrepancy between outer appearance and identification documents is very much possible. However, transgender persons, non-binary persons, intersex persons tend to have a legal sex. In some EU member states, a kind of a third legal category of sex is possible to have that in your passport, but it's still rather rare. And in some of these countries, it is reserved for people with DSDs. So it's not just a category that you can opt into subjectively or identify into subjectively. But really, what most surprised me, as I've been following the Finnish self-ID project of the government quite closely recently, where let's say they are not the government, but the NGOs and the activists are asking for self-ID from people aged 15 and over, and the government says that it should be for 18 and over. I couldn't really believe my eyes when I read from this action plan of the European Commission that, quote, the Commission will foster best practice exchanges between member states on how to put in place accessible legal gender recognition legislation and procedures based on the principle of self-determination and without age restrictions. I don't know whether one should interpret it as the devil's advocate, meaning that, okay, does the European Commission really endorse that toddlers or preschoolers could change their legal sex. This is possible in some countries. Norway is not an EU member state, but from there it's possible from the age of 6, with some restrictions, I think, like parental approval. Surprise, surprise. But referring to what different kinds of human rights bodies on the UN level, in the United Nations, as well as other similar bodies giving out statements on self-ID in the context of law and human rights, I think this reflects a wider lack of awareness of child and adolescent development in the legal and political fields, and to some extent in international human rights law. And it is really quite perplexing, because in designing legal change, many different kinds of expertise should be made use of. But it seems like it is the fingerprint of various transgender lobbyists can then be seen on this document, with both the language of the LGBTIQ and so on, and with this very sweeping, broad idea of self-ID with no age restrictions. Furthermore, the European Commission shows little awareness of the sensitive nature of gathering data relating to sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics, if we want to talk in the language of the Yogyakarta principles, as it vows, for example, to, quote, improve the inclusion of trans, non-binary, and intersex people in relevant documentation, applications, surveys, and processes, unquote. My interpretation is that this could very well be in breach of different kinds of data protection principles, as gender identity, in the way it is usually understood, in the same way as sexual orientation is often regarded as private and sensitive information and should not be included in different kinds of registers. Anonymous surveys would be a different thing. And actually, a colleague pointed a document out to me which relates to this, as perhaps as the last theme we could cover here. It is equal pay, which is, let's say, very much a structural, society-wide issue that affects women, women in society. So an obscured understanding of the term woman regarding, for example, the gender pay gap in this action plan of the Commission. The Commission says, the Commission will continue to support measures under the gender equality strategy intended to improve the socioeconomic position of women, including those that are relevant for LGBTIQ women. So anyone could be a woman except for the G. But very recently, there's been a document processed called the Draft European Parliament Legislative Resolution on Equal Pay, well, to simplify the title. And there it says that since the 1950s, which is when the original treaty for the functioning of the European Union dates from, there have been social and legal changes, okay, as well as research in the medical and biological fields, which have led to the recognition in the definition of sex, of diversity in addition to women and men, okay? So, for example, in some member states, it is currently possible for persons to legally register themselves as having a third of the neutral gender. This is text from the draft legislative resolution. And as I mentioned earlier, yes, in some EU member states, it is possible to have a third legal gender. in view of the purpose and the nature of the rights which the principle of equal treatment seeks to safeguard. It also applies to discrimination arising from the person's gender identity. Fine. But in the same document, in the following paragraph, it says that an employer should only mention workers who do not identify as either female or male in their pay reporting obligations, where those workers are legally registered as not identifying as female or male. So self-identifying as, for example, non-binary does not fit into this. Or where that information has been proactively and voluntarily disclosed to the employer. And this raises more questions of in which context this would be relevant, as having a legal gender marker is much more robust, and having a third legal gender marker is much more of a robust, existing, undisputed thing than personal self-identification. But the main point being that this is private and sensitive information, the way a person identifies when it comes to gender under this new understanding, new individualized understanding of gender. And this is in line with how the law stands, for example, in Finland, where the Act on Equality between Women and Men was amended in 2015 to include gender identity and gender expression. But it is unfortunately not very well known that gender identity is then this kind of private and sensitive information that you're not supposed to ask, do you identify as non-binary, for example, when applying for a job? Or let's say the potential employer is not allowed to ask something like that from a potential employee, but we still see a lot of these kinds of forms both online and offline.
Linda, we're gonna have to finish up in a couple of minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm just coming to kind of my final point, which is that I understand that when we look at what the Women's Declaration says and kind of what our shared goals are, I know that I'm very well aware that in the international arena, there is a rather strong push to not accept gender identity as a legal category at all. And I'm fine with that. But I want to point this out as a kind of a second-hand strategy that in those jurisdictions or contexts where some kind of a third legal category of legal gender is already in place or exists, this is an important thing to remind everyone about, that it is private and sensitive information, and it should not be used in parallel to or in the same way as legal sex, which is still very much male and female in most contexts and jurisdictions.